Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's live chat. It's lovely to be back. I know we're not doing Tudor Talk on a weekly basis, but it makes me treasure being here with you on the YouTube channel with my lovely guests all the more. So hello, and if you are joining us, welcome to this Tudor Talk. I am here. I'm going to be here very shortly, just in a couple of minutes, with my guest for today, and that's Carol Ann Lloyd. But in the meantime, if you are joining us, please do say hello in the comments box. I love to hear from you, and I love to see who's joining us, and I love to see where you are in the world. So definitely do say hello if you are managing to join us live. So I'm just going to give people a couple of minutes to come on board before we get underway with tonight's chat with Carol Ann. And we'll be talking about Carol Ann's new book. I will let Carol Ann talk about that for herself. In the meantime, how's your summer been? I have been out and about, busy collecting podcast material and materials for YouTube videos, etc. It's been a lovely summer, but summer is very definitely drawing to a close here. Now, if you can hear me, if anybody is out there, I'd just also like to do a quick hello, Dana from the USA. Welcome. You are our first one in the chat room today. So thank you so much for saying hello. I was going to say, I always like to do a quick check and find out that people are hearing me clearly and can see me. So if you want to just give me some thumbs up or leave a little comment there in the box just to let me know that we're coming through loud and clear. Oh, hello, Laurie. Hi, it's great to see you. Happy weekend from New Jersey. Well, I don't think you're a million miles away from where our speaker is today. You're definitely, I think you must be around lunchtime there. I've had a bit of inside information on that one. And Victoria, hello. Hi, tuning in from good old Dorset in the UK. Oh, it's getting a bit grey, isn't it now? And a bit darker, Victoria, at this time. Summer definitely feels like it's drawing to a close. Thank you so much to those of you who are leaving comments. Okie dokie. The only other thing I want to say is, I'm always doing it wrong. Honestly, I'm hopeless. This, if you're wondering what this is my QR code for my Instagram. So if you're not following me on Instagram, we've had a lot of people join in the last month, over 20,000 new followers just in the last month. So if you like Instagram and you're not following me, do be a part of the party. I post reels on a daily basis. Particularly if I've been out and about, I like to keep you guys up to date with what I'm doing. Okay, we've had a couple more people drop in. We've got Donald from Chicago. Excellent. I've been to Chicago. It was a few years ago now, but I very much enjoyed myself. I was at the Kellogg University there. And Monica, hello Monica from Italy. Lovely to see you. And great, you can hear me fine. Okay, well, I think we're ready to get going. Enough chat from me. So we have our speaker today, and I wanted to introduce Carol Ann Lloyd. So Carol Ann Lloyd is a speaker and an author, and according to her website, she shares stories and history of Shakespeare to illuminate what is possible in our lives. And I think that's very intriguing, and that might have to be my first question. So with that, I would just like to welcome Carol Ann to the show. Hello, Carol Ann.
Hello, it is wonderful to be here.
Oh, thanks so much for joining us and brightening up what is a very kind of gloomy evening here certainly in Gloucestershire, which is where I'm
All
broadcasting
right.
from.
Well, it is noon here, so we're a bit bright still. So
Uh-huh.
we're hanging on to the sunshine as we can.
Ah,
Here on
lovely. Now, I just wanted to, what I didn't say to folks who are joining is, of course, as ever, this is the live chat. So this is your chat. This is your chance to chat to Carol Ann and ask her all sorts of questions that you might have about her book and what she's writing about. And it's a real different take on the Tudors. I'm going to come to that in a minute. But yeah, what I'd love to ask you is, I read that little bit of your bio and thought, that's really interesting, illuminating what is possible in our lives today. Explain more.
All right. So I really believe that history shows us what's possible. So if we think of history as being a through line, past, present, and future, really all of that is part of history. And what has happened in the past can really help us tap into what is possible for us right now, our potential. If we think about other folks, I particularly look at women who have taken on a role that they weren't expected to succeed in. And if they can in their time, why can't I in mine? So, those kinds of things. We also see some cautionary tales from history. And so, history can also help us know maybe what to avoid a little bit, or at least be cautious about. And the Shakespeare part of that, I think Shakespeare really captures some moments where characters do not attend to history, their place in it, and what has happened and what they can learn. And when they do. And so, as you see someone like Henry V in Shakespeare talk about these people right in front of him right now and how they can draw on what's happened with English victories in the past. And you know that Shakespeare's writing at a time about something in the past, and now Henry's referring to something in the past. But he's also talking about how these men will be remembered far into the future, which is of course what Shakespeare's telling us. And we know now that Agincourt is still, exciting to talk about and people know about it. So just these clear moments where we can see a through line. People, after all, are generally the same. I mean, some stand out as bigger than life, but many of us are trying to be happy and take care of each other and do our best and make the world a better place. And the stories from the past really help us understand the present and the future. So
Mm.
there you go.
Well, it's interesting. A couple of things come up for me because, I can hear that history inspires you personally and the characters
Right,
and the various qualities, particularly
right.
perhaps some of the women, of
Yeah.
the sort of the bear moths of the female bear
Mhm.
moths of history. Can share with us. I very much empathize with that because I very much feel Anne Boleyn is a constant sort of presence in my life with her courage. I
Right.
draw upon that all the time. So I
Yeah.
love the fact that historical figures can just still speak to us and we can still connect with them.
Right. Yes.
Go
Yes.
on, go on. No, please do.
I was just going to say there are just some moments when you think about someone like Anne Boleyn. And there were moments she was facing decisions and pivotal moments. And maybe if she knew the end from the beginning, she wouldn't have rushed back to court at certain moments. Or maybe she would have, because she seemed to have a sense of destiny that gave us Elizabeth. So,
Exactly. Mm.
even something that looks like a failure ultimately for her was a success.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you have some deep roots in Shakespeare. Shakespeare's very much on my mind. I was at his grave actually just
Mm.
last weekend for the first time. So maybe you could tell people who haven't met you before, Carol Ann, um, what's your background? How have you got entangled in Tudor history?
Well, it's a story that you will easily relate to because it starts with Anne Boleyn. So years ago, I was watching TV with my mom, and there's the wonderful Keith Mitchell, The Six Wives of Henry VIII. It was a BBC production, and then in the US, it was shown on PBS. Big shout out for PBS, the public broadcasting system, where we get many wonderful things, including just recently the Boleyn's A Scandalous History, which is now on PBS. So lots of love for PBS. But anyway, I was watching this with my mom. I hadn't been watching the whole thing with her. I sort of walked in, and it was the scenes, sadly, toward the end of Anne Boleyn. But she's being accused of things, and her response is, as she pulls herself up and says, "I am your queen." And I was hooked. I thought, I have to know more about her. I have to know who she is. This is someone who is standing up to a room full of men who are holding big swords. I mean, I was young. I didn't know what all of it meant, but I just knew there was courage and determination, and I needed to know more about her. And boy, once you start trying to learn more about Anne Boleyn, you just can't stop. It's just all so fascinating, as you know. So I just wanted to learn more and more. And I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, which seemed worlds away from England. But my grandmother said to me, if you want to go to England, let's start planning now and make that happen. And just believed I could, even as a child, she believed I could get there. So that kind of support for me and fascination drew me in. And in Utah, we have in Cedar City in southern Utah, a really wonderful Shakespeare festival as well. And so the Shakespeare part and the history, Tudors, same time period part just really was so fascinating to me. I just could not get
Mm.
enough.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my beginning with it. It stayed sort of an obsession. And when I I live in the Washington, D.C. area now, just outside of D.C., and have been just so fortunate. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to first volunteer at the Folger Shakespeare Library, then work for several years at the Folger Shakespeare Library. And now I'm a researcher at the Folger Shakespeare Library, which is a treasure trove of not just Shakespeare, but all kinds of early modern history documents and artifacts. And it includes, and I have seen Queen Elizabeth I's Bible covered in red velvet. It's just a transformational experience. Anytime you visit the Folger, it is they're undergoing some renovation now, but when it reopens next year, if anyone out there comes to DC, give me a shout and I will take you.
Well, there you go, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes.
You've got a personal invitation from somebody who is right at the heart of the Folger Library. So
Yeah.
if you're here, then you're in the
Yes.
know. I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to make a note of that because I've never been. I've
Oh,
been to DC, but not.
mhm.
This was way before I really I was had come out of the closet in terms of my love for the Tudors. Anyway, we should be talking about your book because you are in the midst of writing a new book going to be published by Pen and Sword. And it's unusual, a Tudors by numbers. So can you tell us a little bit about the book, what people can expect, and also what motivated you to write it?
Well, I just became, of course, fascinated with the Tudors, wanted to learn more and more and more, and wanted to come up with my own way of looking at this just fabulous dynasty that gives you highs and lows that are, if it wasn't true, you wouldn't believe it, right? If somebody made up a movie, it just seems unbelievable. But I realized that somehow some of these numbers were so important. And by numbers, we look at like there were one of my favorite numbers. There were two crowned regnant queens in the Tudor dynasty. Okay, that's interesting. But then you look at all the previous dynasties, there were zero crowned regnant queens.
Hmm.
Okay, so we know Mary the First is the first, but just thinking about zero crowned, Matilda tried to get crowned. She defeated her enemies in victory way back, but she couldn't get crowned. The council in London thought she was too ambitious and that her behavior was not meet of the gentler sex. So Mary was really up against it when she was trying to get herself crowned. And then the fact that the next monarch was also a queen. Okay, so those two, that's a big number. But then if you look at subsequent dynasties, the Stuarts and the Hanoverians and beyond, 100% of those dynasties have at least one crowned regnant queen.
Mm.
So we go from 0% to 100%. And what's the difference? The Tudors. And sometimes those numbers, just looking at it that way, gives us a new perspective. And that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah, yeah. And while you're just on that point, what do you think was why? Why did it change? Why suddenly the change? What was it about Mary, of course, and then Elizabeth? I mean, obviously they were heirs to the throne and they were the only viable heirs. But I mean, in times gone by, my feeling is in the early medieval period, like with Stephen and that Matilda, a bloke just would have pitched up and just said, I'm not
Right.
having this, and taken them to war over it, and tried to get the crown back, but it didn't happen in the Tudor period. So what's your take on that?
Well, one thing that's interesting, unlike some of the earlier medieval kings, by the Tudors, they just somehow had a lot more daughters than sons. So many of the potential heirs, and when Edward VI realizes he's dying and he doesn't want to leave the crown to Mary because she's Catholic, but also because she's a woman, he is desperately looking for male heirs who could be a Protestant king. He can't find any. There are 9 women who have a claim to the throne, and there aren't any Protestant men. So, one thing, the Tudors tend not to have as many sons as daughters. Then, because their claim to the throne from the time of Henry VII is a little iffy, to be honest. And both Henry VII and Henry VIII tended to get rid of male challengers to the throne. And so, between not having sons and getting rid of a bunch of the real threats to the throne, there weren't as many men around who could, like Stephen, step up and say, I'm a cousin and I'll take it. There just weren't. So Henry VII is an only child. Henry VIII, by the time he comes to the throne, is an only son because Arthur's died. That's not common in medieval times. Typically, a king comes to the throne with brothers.
Yeah.
And so there's just this dearth of men.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe happenstance certainly helped. I also just had a thought, and it just completely hadn't really occurred to me before, but of course you get this dawn of humanist thinking and the embracing of female education, and I just wonder whether this does actually also herald a slight shift in mindset as well, and you get this coincidence of a combination of factors that makes it just right.
Yes.
Interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so look, tell us some more vital statistics of the Tudors. What do people get interested in, do you think? What are some of the most common things you think people really grapple with and that you've enjoyed sort of looking at?
Okay, so when we think about, there are, so just start with, how many Tudor monarchs are there? There are 5 Tudor monarchs, or are there 6 Tudor monarchs? And that's the Jane Grey question. So as I looked at the Jane Grey question, which I think is fascinating to people, and I did a little survey on social media, was she a queen or was she not a queen? And people are still, first of all, not sure because historians disagree, but they're determined that they have the right opinion. I mean, there's quite a debate going on still whether Jane Grey was queen. So that's, we know, and is out there. But what I found, for me, I know she's called the 9 days queen, but I think she was queen for 13 days. Because in the medieval mindset, that phrase we hear, the king is dead, long live the king, which had been for hundreds of years, the phrase, and then it had to be, with Edward, the king is dead, long live the queen. That doesn't happen when the queen is proclaimed. That happens when the king dies. So it's not like for those 4 days when the council was hiding the death of Edward so they could get everything set up, and John Dudley was managing all of that. It's not really like England became a republic for 4 days. It was still a monarchy. And Jane, if you believe Jane was the queen, she was queen that whole time, even if she wasn't proclaimed. So I think looking just at that number, 9 or 13, makes us really look at the history. If it's a monarchy, someone had to be the monarch.
Very interesting. Very interesting take. I'm going to say 2 things. First of all, just to those people tuning in, Carol Ann, your image, you're still as clear as a bell on audio, but the image is coming a little bit. So I just don't want anybody watching thinking, is it my settings? We've done our best, haven't we, to get the camera, and I think there's a bit of a bandwidth thing going on. But I wanted to put, since you raised this, I thought this was a great time to put this question to our audience that are here today. So if you're watching, do you think Jane Grey was in fact queen or not? And also, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what Carol Ann was just saying about, that's, I mean, it's a really good point. So any thoughts or reflections of that? But maybe you could vote, guys, if you're just pop it in the comments. Do you think Jane Grey was a queen or not? I will keep my eye on the comments. We've had a couple more people say hello, by the way. Monica's saying hello from Italy, and Heidi from Norfolk. Welcome, Heidi. It's the first time you've made one of these. Well, welcome, 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 welcome. And hello, Alan. Good to see you from Scotland. Okay, so that's really fascinating. Is there another one you want to share with us?
Well, if you're sort of related to that one, so if she is a queen, then fully half of the Tudor monarchs are queen, 3 out of 6. 50%. If you think, no, she's not really a queen, still 40% of the Tudor monarchs are women. And however you look at it, when you look at the years, 47% of the Tudor dynasty is under the rule of a woman. And whatever you think about Jane Grey, Mary and Elizabeth rule as the sovereign.
Mm.
Take the final 50 years of the Tudors is female rule. And I think sometimes we do forget how much and what a big deal that was.
Mm.
So there's that. I think that's interesting. Another thing I think is sort of fun to look at when people ask me about Henry VIII and the 6 wives. Yes, that number 6. And of course, the musical 6. And we know about 6, right? It's the most married monarch, and he had more wives than anybody. And for all those reasons, it's fascinating. But if you look at the way it breaks down in terms of time he spent with the different women, he wasn't quite as much on a marital merry-go-round
Mm.
as it's sometimes described, just like always looking for someone else beyond, who's over there kind of thing. In fact, if you look at the beginning of his reign, 1509, which is when he married Catherine of Aragon, until Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536, when the two of them were both gone, 70% of his reign was spent with those two women. 70%.
Mm-hmm.
He actually was very loyal early on. He really wanted those two marriages to work early on.
Yeah.
So then in 11 years, he marries 4 more women and has a 3.5 year period of bachelorhood that's split into 2 after the death of Jane Seymour, after the death of Catherine Howard. But those at the end, now certainly he didn't want Jane Seymour to die. And his marriage to Catherine Parr ended because he died, right? But he ended the other 2. He probably didn't want, I don't know that he wanted his marriage to Catherine Howard to end as it did. I think he wished that had never happened. So even so, really the only marriage he was eager practically from the start to have be over was Anne of Cleves.
Mm.
So he really tried in his own way to be loyal. And those 2 women at the beginning, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, 70% had so much influence on who he became as a king, as a man, as a husband. It's just fascinating to think about how much time they spent with him.
Yeah, I always remember before this was years back, when I first came to the Tudor story, I absolutely really didn't appreciate that he'd been with Catherine for 20 years. I remember being quite shocked by that when I very first kind of clocked that. Right, I'm going to ask a controversial question. I always feel like I want to duck the rotten tomatoes that might be coming in my direction. Oh dear, because I'm obviously on social media quite a lot, and I don't see too many people speaking very positively of Henry VIII, to be fair. Do you think, given what you've said, that he was trying his best to be faithful, and maybe he genuinely felt he was being let down by these women in various ways, whether, they were not just failing to deliver a son or had, sort of been accused of adulterous relationships? Do you think he gets a bad rap? Do you think he deserves the reputation he has?
I think, and I'm on social media too, so just get your little tomatoes ready. I do think that he was doing his best. I think he knew deep in his heart, as did pretty much everybody else, that he needed a son to follow him. Now, we know from our perspective that things worked out pretty well with Elizabeth. But if Mary had ruled for longer and had children, and Spain had become the premier country and taken over England, which was possible with a foreign marriage, it might feel different. Her reign might feel different. So I think Henry was not different in believing he needed a son. And I certainly think especially with Catherine of Aragon, he was all in that marriage. He did everything he could to be faithful to her. He was loyal to her for many years. His having affairs, we know he had an affair with Bessie Blunt during that marriage and with Mary Boleyn. We don't know about scores of mistresses, which is sometimes, put forward as a possibility. We just don't know that. But if you compare that to someone like Francois I, who had official mistresses and had many mistresses, Henry wasn't certainly the most abominable husband by any means. I think he was trying to be loyal to Catherine. He courted Anne Boleyn for 7 years. They had a relatively short marriage, but he was all in for 7 years, standing up to the Pope, would break it all. He was doing all of that. So I think his initial inclination was to try and be a good husband. And his parents had had a surprisingly close marriage, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, for it having been a completely political marriage. What Henry saw growing up was two people who were committed to each other. And I think that's what he wanted. And I think he did try to get that. Now, when he was thwarted a bit, he didn't behave very well.
Yeah, and of course, towards the end of his life, he really became very irascible.
Right.
Probably
Yes.
hugely aggravated by the physical discomfort and pain. I mean, not excusing it away, but it certainly didn't help matters. But
Right.
yeah, I mean, he did some pretty dreadful things. But I also tend to probably err on the slightly more generous side in terms of my view of Henry. I don't think any of us could possibly know the pressure he felt being a king in a relatively new dynasty, and
Right.
the pressure of delivering an heir. But at
Right.
the same time, that doesn't excuse all of the horrible things he
It
did.
doesn't excuse the way he went about it, but his desire to deliver an heir and a spare to at least two sons. He had lived the reality of one of the sons dying when Arthur died, his older brother. So he knew that was a real possibility. And he also knew his father. I mean, he knew the story. He knew his father had taken the throne, and that there were a lot of people who thought that the Tudors didn't belong there. So it was real pressure, as you say.
Yeah. I once had the pleasure of doing an interview for a blog. It was with one of the reenactors at Hampton Court Palace who played Henry VIII, and I went to interview him. He was in costume. We were in Hampton Court Palace, and I was with him in character for like an hour and a half, and actually it was quite. I mean, obviously I knew he was a reenactor, but actually he did such a good job that I almost felt completely sympathetic to him by the end of it. It was quite something else. Anyway, it did make me think, I wonder what I really would feel if I had a chance to talk to him about it. Now, we've had a couple of folk. Now, a couple of folk have definitely voted for the fact that Jane Grey was a queen. So that's Laurie and Cynthia. Thank you so much. Hi, Cynthia. Lovely to see you. And Cynthia's also said Henry was raised by women. I believe he really liked the company of them. So yes, I think that's definitely a side of it. Okay, shall we move on from Henry? Is there anything else you'd like, any other examples that can help enliven our understanding of Tudor history and our enjoyment? Because it's kind of a fun way to think about it as well, I think. That's right. Bite-sized chunks. You can take a bite-sized chunk and dive into one thing and think about that, and then think about something else.
Right. And I've tried to make it sort of fun to work through, and you don't necessarily have to go in order, although you can. It's not necessarily chronological at all. Because, for example, I look at the three kings together, and I look at the two queens together rather than Henry VII, Henry VIII, and Edward, so I don't always do it chronologically. But one of the numbers that I start off with Henry VII, and I think we often overlook Henry VII just a bit. I mean, it's just so tempting to want to jump right to Henry VIII. That story just is so enticing. And Henry VII's story isn't always as enticing. So I wanted to sort of look at that, because I do think he's the architect. He and his mother, Margaret Beaufort, I think Margaret Beaufort's just amazing. But maybe the two of them are the architects of the Tudor dynasty.
Scares me. She totally scares me. I think I'd be quivering at my knees if I...
Yeah, you don't want to get in her way, right? And so she is a huge advocate for her son. But I'm looking at Henry Tudor, who becomes Henry VII, and sort of how he gets there. And one of the things that you can't miss if you're in England, or if you're looking at British money or watching or looking at the coronation regalia, is the Tudor rose, right? The Tudor rose is ubiquitous. And so I started doing some research on the Tudor rose, which is based on Henry VII's interesting math, which is one red rose plus one white rose equals one Tudor rose. And that is more than just a pretty symbol. That is the essence of the message he was attempting to sell to the English people. So Henry VII, when he met Richard at the Battle of Bosworth, so he was just Henry Tudor then, he had been in exile in France and in Brittany for 14 years. 14 years since he had set foot in the land. And he'd spent a lot of that time away from court. People think he didn't spend any nights at court before Bosworth. So he was unknown. He'd been away for 14 years. He comes in and he manages, surprisingly, to defeat this brilliant strategist, Richard III, who was, whatever you think of him, he was the warrior you would want on your side. I mean, he had been Edward IV's right-hand man in battles for years. He was really great. And somehow this ragtag army of mercenaries and discontents fighting for Henry Tudor. And then, of course, the Stanley men came in and that helped. Okay, so then he goes into London to be proclaimed king, and nobody even knows him. And he's fought all this time under the Red Dragon of Wales. And it is not until after Bosworth, when he gets to London, that somehow he comes up with this rose idea. And out of whole cloth invents this story. Now, it is true that the white rose is associated with Edward IV. So one of the things I got to see at the Folger was this beautiful genealogical roll of Edward IV. And there are white roses, as well as many other emblems, but there are white roses on it. Great. But the red rose has not been a consistent Lancastrian symbol up to this time.
Interesting.
And it was used by Henry Bolingbroke before he became Henry IV, but it was crimson and it was also gold. And since then it hadn't been. Henry VI certainly did not use the red rose. So he kind of made it up. And then had his portrait rather, painted holding a red rose. But he had not fought under a red rose. He had fought under a dragon. But he made it up and brought those two roses together. And I think the fact he was able to reduce all the complications of what we now call the Wars of the Roses, I believe because of Henry VII. Not that it was called that at that time, but he introduced the idea of, let's make the Yorkists white, let's make the Lancastrians red, let's pretend it was all just one versus one, because really the families were battling, people changed sides, there were other families involved. It was not just a lovely rose bush. It was a tangled mess. It was thorny and complicated. And he gives us this new narrative that ends with that one red rose, one white rose, one Tudor rose, and that's him. He is the definition. When he marries Elizabeth of York, he has united the warring factions, and there is no reason for people to keep fighting for the throne. That needs to be over now, and we're moving on. And he's so successful with that. It's so easy for people to understand. And even though that doesn't mean he doesn't have any challenges for the throne, he does. The Yorkists continue, but he's able to overcome them, and he sticks to that narrative. And the Tudor rose, he just sets Arthur up to be the Tudor rose. And then when Arthur dies, we know that Henry VIII, at his accession, the book that Thomas More writes for him is decorated with many, many Tudor roses right through Elizabeth. And late in Elizabeth's reign, and I love this moment, late in Elizabeth's reign, when Shakespeare's play Henry VI is on the stage, there's a scene in the Temple Garden where they're plucking red roses and they're plucking white roses. And that narrative that Henry VII created has now just become accepted. It is embodied in that scene. And eventually we call it the Wars of the Roses, from that one narrative Henry VII comes up with. So that's one of the kinds of things I love, because he just boils it all down to one.
That's really clever and really interesting. So you made me think of a couple of things as you were talking about the White Rose of the House of York, because you may not know, but I'm a Yorkshire girl. So I am definitely under the white flag. And you still go to Yorkshire now and you'll see people with the White Rose of Yorkshire flying. But it made me think, I wondered at that moment as you were talking about it, and you partially answered my question when you said that the Red Lord of Lancaster hadn't been particularly associated with the House of Lancaster. But I was already asking myself, I wonder if the White Rose of Yorkshire came about, well, actually, it obviously came about during the reign of Edward IV, but maybe earlier. I was just wondering how long those symbols have persisted associated with the counties of Lancaster and York, or whether they really became embedded in the counties of England after, Henry VII had really kind of brought these two symbols to the forefront of people's minds. I simply don't know the answer to that.
Well, and we know, although Edward certainly used the white rose and was known as the white rose and all of that, but when Richard III comes along, he didn't use a white rose.
No.
So it wasn't yet completely associated. Elizabeth of York takes it up, but Richard didn't use it at all.
Yeah.
So I don't think it was yet, the York family was yet bought in to that idea. And Edward IV used other symbols as well. That was one of many.
Yeah, Laurie's just pointed out, what about Edward IV's symbol of the sun in splendor too? So
Right.
yeah, so
Right.
there were obviously more than one.
Yes. But the rose is what worked for Henry. So he very much cherry picked his symbol. Yes.
And it also made me laugh as you were talking, because I'm thinking of some brilliant equivalent of a Tudor marketeer, Today we go to PricewaterhouseCoopers and say, I've got a bit of a problem. I need to create a brand, and you pay like £5 million.
Yes.
Something. And so some bright spark, whether it was Henry or whether it was somebody else who was an early marketeer, it was genius, wasn't it? I mean, it was genius.
It was genius, and I don't think there's a better example of branding, because to this day it is everywhere. That Tudor rose, which is sometimes now even called the English rose. So it is everywhere. And yeah, he did remarkably well. Even though we don't often look at him, boy, everybody sure knows what that Tudor rose is.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see it everywhere. I love it. I mean, it's a beautiful thing as well. I think it's just so aesthetically pleasing. Anyway, folks, thank you still for joining us here. It's lovely to have you with us. I'm talking to Carol Ann Lloyd, who is a speaker and a writer of history and definitely a Shakespeare buff, aren't you? Deeply, yes, absolutely. And who is currently writing a new book called Tudors by Numbers. Or no, is Tudors by Numbers? Is that the actual? Or
you've got the title? The Tudors by the Numbers.
Tudors by Numbers. And that's going to be out, I think, next year. But Carol Ann, you'll tell us a little bit more details about that in a moment. So if you are joining us, please do feel free to ask Carol Ann any questions you would like. In fact, we've just had Victoria say, thank you, Victoria. I'm going to see if I can drag this onto the screen, and then you should be able to see it. There you go. Look, that's true, actually. So our British Labour Party, yeah. So I wonder why they did that then. That's interesting, isn't it? So more of a comment than a question per se. But yeah, interesting. Thank you. So yes, please do drop any questions you have, or comments or thoughts or reflections in the chat, and I'll try and put all of those, or as many of those as possible, to Carol Ann. So I was just wondering whether there were any particular statistics that surprised you. I mean, maybe the Rose did as well, but if there are any other examples of things that once you got your teeth into and you started researching them, whether it sort of opened a Pandora's box or a whole new vista on something that you hadn't completely appreciated before.
Well, one thing that sort of, one chapter I have is the way the Tudors really changed things. So I came up with about 9 ways that I thought they really had changed some things. And one easy, or it seems sort of simple way was breakfast. So at the beginning of the Tudor reign, most people ate two meals. And by the end of the Tudor reign, most people, and of course, we don't have records of people throughout the countryside. So I realize whenever we're saying these things, it's based on what we do know and the records we do have. And so it's not universally true. But of the records we do have, most of those people are eating three meals. So the evolution of breakfast, and I'd heard that before. Oh, yeah, the Tudors invented breakfast was a headline I'd seen, an article I'd read. But when you really look at what was behind that, some of it was a need to take care of people. So often you would get up and you would be up for a while, and then you would eat your dinner around 11 or maybe 12. You wouldn't have eaten before. And then toward the end, around 6-ish, you'd maybe have supper. And the way that many people lived. But if you were elderly, if you were ill, you might get something earlier in the morning to help you get through because you weren't able to. Well, one of the things that sadly happens after the dissolution of the monasteries is there are more and more people who have to be taken care of that are no longer at the
Uh-huh.
monasteries, where maybe they've been eating breakfast, but we haven't had records of it. Right? So now they're in homes of people who are trying to take care of people, or they're just more visibly this new population. It's not really a new population, but it's newly seen because they've been taken care of by the monasteries and they're not anymore. So that's one thing. Also, the economics changed. So during the Tudor times and the enclosures that had started earlier, and then in Edward's reign really take over, and more people are coming into London. And we see an economic shift where people are working for each other. They're working for somebody. And there are laws that say you can take an hour for dinner, but you must work from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Or if it's light longer, you must work till 8 p.m. Well, if you're going to try and have dinner, well, you're going to have to push it back if you don't leave work till 8 p.m. So maybe you're going to want that dinner more at noon or 1. You're going to have to eat something in the morning before you go to work. So the economics of that was interesting and new to me, just thinking about it in
Hmm.
that way.
Yeah.
And just the difference in the way people were living, and this often was happening in cities. London just exploded in population, so I want to make sure by 1600 the population in London had gone from about 50,000 at the beginning of the Tudor reign to 200,000.
Yeah.
Now, the
Big growth.
city itself hadn't grown, the population had grown. So
Hmm.
people were crowded, and it was, there were some really nice, beautiful homes, and there were not so nice, not so beautiful places people were living. But they were trying to earn money. They were working all these long hours. And so they were having to eat earlier, this huge influx of people into London. Also, foreigners were coming and they were adapting to English ways. And so it's just this really interesting way. You look at how the population's growing, you look at the economics, you see the people changing their way of life, including something as simple as when they're eating. And now we have 3 meals a day. That's just kind of thing that we don't realize how important it is in looking at the lives of people.
Yeah, and we've had a couple of, it is interesting, isn't it, when you dive into these things and you just get a new light shed upon something. So we've had two questions come in. I'm just going to drag Joanna's onto the screen there. Did people retire? What did they live off? Any thoughts on that?
That is a great question. What you wanted to do is be wealthy, and then you could live off your land.
Mm,
Working people had to live off their labor. And so that's one of the reasons, and there were many, but that's one of the reasons that if you worked on the land, you wanted a nice big family of sons who can carry things on, of daughters who can marry into other wealthy families. That's your future. And really, what they lived off was their children.
yeah.
And so you want to have plenty of healthy children who are bringing in enough income to keep you going in the family home forever. Because again, with monasteries gone,
Yeah.
there aren't a lot of options.
It's that extended family thing, isn't it? That
Right.
actually I think
Yes.
we could all benefit a bit more from actually today.
Right. Yes. Yes. And communities. We do see communities sort of banding together when you get outside of London or York or some of
Mm,
the bigger cities and into the smaller villages. We do see communities, but it's very much a family thing. Yes.
yeah.
Families are it.
And we've got Susan S. Is this Susan Stolman? I don't know. Maybe Susan, you can let me know. I thought bread and ale were eaten in the private quarters of courtiers' rooms upon waking. I must admit that I've read that too. And how does that tie into what you've just been saying?
So, yes, at court, sometimes things were different, right? And so you might have something private at court if you were on um, the upper scale. And so there are some records, and I believe it's Cecily. Um, Cecily's an interesting woman, right? Cecily, and she becomes the mother of these Yorkist kings, even though she comes through the family of the Beauforts, and they are the Lancastrians. So she's a really great figure of this is more complicated than we think. But in Cecily's household, there's a pretty clear delineation who gets that breakfast or that bread and ale in the morning and who doesn't. And so if you were on the upper end, yes, you would
Hmm.
get. So if you were serving like a serving person of the monarch and had to get up to make sure that the king or queen is fine, yes, you would often get that as a lady in waiting or as a steward.
Okay,
But
thank
then
you for
there's
that.
this gap of people who don't get it at the beginning of the reign.
Sorry, Susan, I'm mistaking you for somebody else. It's Susan from in Illinois. Hello in Illinois. I've never been to Illinois. What do I need to go
Oh,
and see in Illinois? Somebody tell me. That would be lovely. I love what's the famous thing about Illinois? You'll have to tell me, Susan. Okay, lovely. Right. So, yeah, and I'm now sort of maybe you've already answered this question, but I was thinking about some of the new nooks and crannies, real detailed stuff that you might have kind of got lost down the rabbit hole.
mhm.
I think that you've probably talked about a couple of those, but was there anything in particular that really was totally new to you?
Well, I will tell you. So one of the things I looked at is the way Tudors through the reign used progresses. I call them royal road trips to go visit, right? And they all used them differently. Edward and Mary didn't use them much at all. Henry VII did. First year of his reign, he was out on progress. So that was interesting to me. I had not realized how early they started. But it was Elizabeth, and she really made the most. I mean, she certainly, I think, inherited Henry VII's sense
Mhm.
of branding. She had her own brand and was very successful. So I think that might be a family
Mm,
talent.
I think you're right.
I just really think we don't often compare those two at all, but I
Yeah.
do think that I see that in her very much. But it's the 19 days she spent at Kenilworth in 1575 at that progress, which is often thought of as Robert Dudley's sort of last attempt to win her over. And so I thought, okay, well, yes, that's a 19-day progress. She stayed for one person for 19 days with one person. That's long. She usually didn't stay that long with somebody. And that's what makes that important. But as I got into the details of his preparation for that progress, and I felt like I was going down a couple of rabbit holes. One thing he did that I didn't expect at all was he commissioned all this art.
Mm.
He had a beautiful art collection. But for that progress, he commissioned portraits of himself and Elizabeth that were companion portraits that he would hang together in his home as if they are a couple. Now, it was very political, so he couldn't have them looking at each other in these portraits. They would have to sort of both look off to the side or whatever. But hanging them together was quite a statement. And there was more than one pairing of these two portraits that he had commissioned specially for that progress. I did not realize that. I didn't realize he put all of his art on display, which was his way of possibly his way of showing he's worthy of her. His
Mm.
his wealth and his splendor. The other thing I was interested in was the princely pleasures. There's a record of the princely pleasures at Kenilworth that includes many masks that were performed for the queen. But when you go to other records, you learn that not all of these masks were allowed to be performed, because when the queen found out what was in them, she forbade them. She said, "You absolutely cannot perform them." And she was much more involved in the entertainment than I had realized. One of the things I think Dudley got wrong in some of these is there would be an Elizabeth character, not called Elizabeth, but clearly a character representing the queen, who would need to be rescued by someone who, of course, would be him. She didn't want to have everybody thinking she would need to be rescued. Now, at the end, of course, they all sort of ended with these two characters getting married. She wasn't really looking for that either, but she definitely did not want these presentations, these representations of her needing to be rescued.
She's the
But
last person who would want that.
how could he have known her that well and gotten that wrong? That sort of surprised me. But then he still paid to have those original masks included in the princely pleasures he had published. So he published an account of that progress that wasn't really what happened. So
Yeah.
I didn't real I mean, those were the kinds of things that I just didn't realize, all of the politics at every moment. Of course, there's politics going on, but that I couldn't figure out why he would think it was a good idea to show her being rescued. And then that she was so involved, she had to okay things before they went on, and she didn't okay those. So that there wasn't, all of that back and forth was really interesting to me.
Yeah. Quite hard to
And
have a romantic relationship when all of that politics is going on, isn't it,
right,
really?
yes,
You know?
yes, yeah.
And I know a little bit about that double portrait because I had the pleasure of interviewing Professor Susan Doran,
Ah,
who's
excellent. Yeah.
and that portrait, certainly the sketches of both Elizabeth and Dudley
Hmm.
survive, and the
Hmm.
portrait I think survives. It's in a really obscure museum somewhere. I can't remember off the top of my head where it is, but if anybody wants to read more about it, I do have a blog. Maybe just search Tudor Travel Guide Elizabeth and Robert Dudley Kenilworth portraits, probably pop up. But yeah, you'll be able to see the portraits that Carol Ann is
Hmm.
talking about and read a little bit more about them. But it is quite fascinating.
Yeah. So all of this politicking and all of this staging of monarchy was going on all the time. And Robert Dudley really knew, he didn't always get it right, but he knew the value of it. And he was playing at that level.
We have a really good question from Laurie. First of all, just say hello, Christine in Spain, and Denise from the US. I don't know where you are in the US, but welcome, welcome, welcome. But Laurie, I'm going to pull this over onto the screen. Specifically researched the number of executions that each monarch carried out during their reigns. Did you do any research on that?
Well, I did do some. What you'll find with Henry VIII is the numbers really vary from 30,000 to 60 or 70,000. Some people think the top number is just way too high. So it's not always clear. Okay. One thing that is clear is that idea of Bloody Mary being the most bloody of the Tudors is not at all accurate. So during the period of time, and she did burn some people at the stake, right? That did happen, and there was about a 2-year period where she did about 300 people. Not quite. 280 is sometimes the number you see, around 280, just under 300, but that was over a 2-year period. We know that Edward VI, and we don't think of him as being quite as much of a bloody king as you might. After the Ketz Rebellion, he ordered the execution of 300 people in just about a 2-week period who were rebels. And so, in a much shorter period of time, killed just about the same number of people. And you don't hear anybody saying bloody Edward. So, Elizabeth ruled a lot longer, as did Henry VIII. And so, yes, their numbers would naturally be up. What we see more with Elizabeth, he was sort of an equal opportunity executioner when it came to religion. On the same day, sometimes you'll find um, someone being executed for papistry, for following the Pope, and on the same day, someone else for heresy. So it didn't matter which line you were on if you were on his bad list. Elizabeth typically was executing people for treason rather than their religious
Right.
belief.
Yeah.
And that really is what made Mary stand out so much, is because it was specifically belief
Mm-hmm.
based
Mm.
rather than you're treasonous, you're a threat to the country.
Yeah.
So that is
Interesting.
one of the reasons that Mary's
That's a
really
That's a
stand
really interesting distinction that I hadn't really thought about before, but very interesting. And I do have a friend who thinks Edward VI would have been more psychopathic than Henry if he'd actually kind of grown to adulthood and become king. And the more I think about him, the more I think I have a tendency to agree with her.
that could vary. And what's interesting with Edward, and I think what might contribute to that very possibility, he's the only Tudor. The moment he's born, he is absolutely the heir to the throne, and then he becomes the king. He is never out of favor. He is never out of the succession. He's never number two son.
Yeah.
He's never, he doesn't have to fight for anything.
Mm,
He just gets it all handed to
spoiled.
him.
Yeah.
And he's the only one.
Yeah.
And so that might lead to that notion that he always got everything. He always knew.
Yeah, interesting. Well, on that note, can you believe it? Can you Adam and Eve it? It's 4 minutes to the hour, which means our hour is nearly up. Shocker, where did that go? So I think we definitely, first of all, Laurie said interesting, thank you. I think the next thing we should do is ask you about the book. When's it coming out? And any other projects you want to tell us about that are, that we might need to know about, and how to get hold of you as well. If people want to connect with you, where can they
Yeah,
connect with you?
I hope you will. I would just love to connect with you. The book is The Tudors by the Numbers. It's coming out from Pen and Sword in summer 2023. And if you do sign up and follow me on social media, I'll give you more details as I get them. So you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at Shake Up History, or Carol Ann Lloyd, also on LinkedIn. So those are the places. I also have a podcast, British History, Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. And this month, speaking of, can you believe it? I am kicking off season 3 next week. So I'm very excited. Of course, it's September, so it's going to be a very Elizabethan month with some really fun people. I do quite a bit of speaking at the Smithsonian here in DC, but with Smithsonian streaming, one of those silver linings of the pandemic, which I don't mean to say was not troubling and hard for us all. But we do have a lot more online opportunities, and the Smithsonian talks are now online. So this might be scary to you, Sarah, but I'm giving a talk on Tuesday, the 27th of September, about Margaret Beaufort as the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty. So that's happening. And then the last Wednesday of both September and October, I'm doing some Tudor talks for Heritage Lincolnshire. So if you go on heritagelincolnshire.org, you can find out more information about that. And I just have to say, because I feel like I've been waiting my whole life to say, on Tuesday, October 25th, I will be speaking at the Smithsonian about Anne Boleyn. And when I was a younger woman, I used to go to talks at the Smithsonian about Anne Boleyn.
Oh,
So this just feels like my life has come to where it was meant to. So
oh,
I would love to have any or all of you join me for those again. And I'm at carolannlloyd.com. So Carol Ann at carolannlloyd.com. If you want to email me, that'd be great. I'd love to hear from you.
that's lovely. So just a couple of comments. Thank you, Alan, for your thanks. And we've got Maria saying, thank you, very interesting chat from Arizona. And Laurie, interesting. Thank you. And great. So good. So I'm going to say cheerio. What I'm going to do, folks, if you just hold on for a moment, I'm going to say thank you, Carol Ann. You've been amazing today. Thank you for taking us through getting us to see Tudors in a different way through numbers. Lovely. Right. And we'll see you soon.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, folks, just one announcement from me before I finish up here. And that is quickly, actually, it's coming on the back of what Carol Ann was saying about Anne Boleyn, because I have my annual virtual summit coming up the last weekend in October, which is the 29th and the 30th of October. And it is called 500 Years sorry, I'll start that again. 500 Years of Anne Boleyn, It Girl, Icon, Legend. And I have a fabulous lineup of speakers. We've got Tracy Borman, we've got Dermot McCulloch, we've got Gareth Russell, Natalie Gruniger talking about her new book that she's been researching on the last year of Anne Boleyn's life. We've got Kate McCaffrey from Hever Castle and Professor Glenn Richardson. And it's all about relationships. So we're looking really at Anne's life, who shaped her character and who shaped her destiny, and it's all about the relationships with some of the key people in her life, such as obviously Henry, Thomas Cromwell, Wolsey, her relationship with Elizabeth. Tracy Borman talks to us about that, and it's a cracker. It's going to be over 2 days. Everything's pre-recorded, but they will be live streamed over the course of the 2 days. You just need to purchase your ticket in advance, and actually then you can tune in and either watch the videos as they go up, or you can tune in at any time over the course of the next 3 months, because the videos will remain viewable for you to watch time and time and time again, as many times as you like, up until the 31st of December. So now, if you are interested in taking part, and they are popular, there's no limit on the number of people taking part, because this is a virtual event, of course. But if you want to be kept in the know about tickets when they go on sale, and they should be going on sale in little under 2 weeks, then make sure you subscribe to me via my website, which is www.thetudortravelguide.com, and you can, so there are many places there that you can subscribe, get on my mailing list, and then of course my mailing list will be the first to hear of when those tickets go live. Okay, so thank you so much. I'm just having a quick look down the comments. Excellent, lovely, thank you. Some lovely to see old friends. Thank you so much for coming back and supporting Tudor Talk. It's been great to have you here. As you know, I kind of do these spontaneously now when the occasion arises. So I'm not going to promise and say I'll be back next week. But if you do want to keep up with me on a regular basis, I've done it again. That's if you will point your mobile phone here with your camera, it will take you through to my Instagram account. If you're not following me on Instagram, I do daily reels mostly, and also live chats on Friday afternoon UK time. If you can't make them live, of course, they stay on the account. I do my own history hit chat, the Tudor Travel Guide weekly history hit chat, which is on 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. And then I'm also taking part in another live Insta chat with two of my colleagues, Philippa from British History Tours and Deborah Royal from Tudor Places, and we are talking always about visiting Tudor Britain. So if you want inspiration for places to go and see and visit, then that is the place for you. Okay, right. Whew. I need to go and lie down now. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you again soon, my friends. Bye for now.